The wrench was a 5/8 combination, forged in a plant that had shut its gates in Granite City before Terrell Brooks was born, and for 12 years it rode in the back right pocket of his coveralls the way other men carried a phone. He had carried it to his father's funeral and carried it back to the bay that same night because grief made his hands want the weight of something useful. Filed into the steel on the box end by hand were 2 letters, O.B. The man who filed them had been dead 12 years. On a cold Tuesday night in February, a man worth $1.3 billion lifted that wrench off a fender, turned it slow under the shop light, and read those 2 letters out loud. Terrell did not know the stranger had spent 40 years looking for the hand that filed them. The stranger did not know that hand was Terrell's father. What the next 90 minutes settled between them would close a debt no one had ever been able to name. Starting with the night both men had been carrying in opposite directions for 4 decades. It started with a car that would not start. Terrell came up at 4:50 most mornings before the alarm, the way his body had learned to in a house where the heat got rationed by the dollar. By 5:30 he had the coffee going on the hot plate his mother had cooked on, an iron skillet still sitting beside it because he had never gotten around to taking it home and never would. By 6 he was at the bay on the corner of Ladue and Carrowmore in the part of North St. Louis where the houses still stood in long rows, even where every third one had gone dark and the city had stopped sending a truck for the leaves. Brooks' auto had 2 bays, a door that stuck in the cold, and a sign his father had paid a man named Sweet to paint in 1990, gold letters going gray now at the edges. Otis Brooks had opened it the year his son was born and had run it until the spring his liver quit on him, in a hospital bill that arrived in installments for 3 years after the funeral. Terrell ran it alone now. He was 34. He had a master technician's hands and a checking account that had not crossed $400 in either direction since October. The math of his life was simple, and he did it without resentment because his father had taught him early that complaining about a number did not change the number. Labor he charged at $80 an hour when he charged it at all. Rent on the bay was $1,200 a month to a holding company over in Clayton that he had never met and never would, and it had gone up $60 in January with a letter that called the increase a market adjustment, as though a market were a kind of weather and not a man somewhere deciding a thing. The remaining medical paper from his father came to $9,000 and change. He sent what he could against it, some months $100, some months $6.25, because $6.25 was what was left after the gas card and Miss Clara's parts. He did not own credit card, he owned the skillet, the sign, $2,000 in tools accumulated one Christmas at a time over 12 years, and the wrench. His days had a shape, and the shape was the thing that kept him steady. Diagnostics in the morning when his ears were sharp and the street was quiet enough to hear a motor think. The hard tear-downs before lunch when his back was still good. After lunch the brake jobs and the oil changes and the alternators, the work that paid the rent, the work that any kid with a phone in a parking lot could do but that people up and down Carrowmore still brought to Terrell because he had never once in 12 years told a customer the car needed a thing it didn't. That was the first thing his father had taught him about money, before he had taught him a single thing about an engine. A man'll forgive you a high price, Otis used to say, in the slow Delta cadence he never lost in 40 years up north. He will never forgive you a lie. You want a customer for life, you tell folks the truth even on the days the truth don't pay. On the days the truth did not pay, Terrell told it anyway, and went home and ate cold greens at the bench. And the customer came back the next time and the time after that, and sent their cousin, and that was how a 2-bay shop survived in a part of the city the Banks had drawn a line around. Otis Brooks had come up out of Greenwood, Mississippi, in 1958, 18 years old, with a cardboard suitcase, a Bible his mother pressed on him at the door, and a wrench his own father had handed him on the platform at the train. He had ridden the Illinois Central North the way half the block had ridden it, the long migration out of the Delta, men and women leaving the cotton country with everything they owned in a sack and a coat, looking for a city where a black man would be paid for his hands and not just worked half to death for them. Otis landed in St. Louis because the train stopped there, the Great Brown River was there, and a cousin had a couch and a lead on a job. He learned cars in a fleet garage off Goodfellow Boulevard, because none of the dealerships downtown would put a black man on the floor in 1960, and he was better than every man who turned him away, and he knew it, and he never once let them see that he knew it. By 1990 he had his own 2 bays and his name in gold, and his initials filed into the one tool he said he would sell the building before he would sell. He filed those letters the day he signed the lease. O.B. Terrell had watched him do it one time as a boy of 7, at the kitchen table with the radio on, the file going back and forth, the steel coming up bright under the dust, his father blowing it clean and turning it to the window to check the letters caught the light. "Now everybody know whose it is," Otis had said, "and ain't nobody can say different." Terrell had not understood it then. He understood it now every day, 200 times a day. He carried it now, and he did not think of it as a keepsake, because keepsakes go in drawers and this thing worked. He thought of it as the best 5/8 he had ever held, balanced exactly right, the chrome worn to a soft warm gray at the spots where 2 generations of Brooks' hands had gripped it. It bit a stubborn bolt the way the newer ones didn't, the way only an old forged tool will. He reached for it without looking, the way you reach for the hand of someone you have walked a long road beside. The other thing he had inherited and thought about even less was the habit of fixing what he could reach. There was a widow 3 doors up, Miss Clara Dupree, 79 years old, who drove a 2004 Corolla with 214,000 miles on it to the 8 o'clock service at Greater Mount Zion every Sunday and to the dialysis center on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 5:45 in the morning, and Terrell kept that car alive for the cost of parts and not $1 more. He had told her so once early on, and when she drew herself up to argue he had said, "Miss Clara, my daddy'd come up out the ground and whup me, let it be." She brought him a foil pan of cornbread and a quart of greens cooked down with smoked turkey every couple of weeks instead, set it on the bench without a word and went back up the block, and he ate it cold at the workbench at noon, and it was the best thing he ate all week, and they both understood that this was a kind of payment that worked better than money. There were others, and he kept no list of them. There was Pop Rubin, who ran the barber shop 2 doors down and was Pop to everybody under 60. Whose 1998 Crown Victoria Terrell kept on the road in exchange for a haircut once a month, and the standing right to sit in the 3rd chair on a slow afternoon and be told he worked too hard and ought to find himself a wife. There was a girl named Trina from down the block who had bought a Civic with a salvage title and a transmission that slipped, and Terrell had not just fixed it but stood her in front of the open hood and walked her through every single thing he did and why, so that no shop in the city would ever be able to look at her face and decide she was somebody who could be cheated. There was a man who slept some nights in the alley behind the bay, a veteran named Curtis whom Terrell never asked a single question, and for whom he left the side bathroom unlocked and a thermos of the coffee going warm on the bench, and never spoke of it to anyone. He did not keep a ledger of any of it. There was no tab. His father had been firm about the tab. When Otis died, men Terrell had never laid eyes on came to the repast in the basement of Greater Mount Zion. Big men in good suits, small men in their one clean shirt, a deacon, a city bus driver, 2 brothers who owned a soul food place out on Natural Bridge. And they stood up one after another between the pound cake and the macaroni and said what Otis Brooks had done for them when they had nothing. A starter put in for free the week before a man's first day at a job he could not have kept without a car. A daughter's first car gone over top to bottom as a graduation gift to a family that thought he was just being neighborly. A whole winter of a single mother's commute kept running on parts Otis bought out of his own pocket and never mentioned. Terrell sat there at 22 with a plate going untouched in his lap and understood, for the first time and all at once, that his quiet father had been holding up a corner of a whole neighborhood with 2 bays and a 5/8 wrench, and had never said a word about any of it across the dinner table in 22 years. His father had said other things across the dinner table. He had a way of laying a sentence down and letting it sit there like a tool on a bench, to be picked up when you needed it and not before. "You fix what you can reach," he would say, and he might not say anything else for an hour. Terrell had heard it 10,000 times and had only truly heard it the day he buried the man. The reason Terrell was alone was not a dramatic reason. There had been a woman, Danielle, a good one, a school nurse, who had wanted a life that started after 7 in the evening and ran across a few weekends, and the shop did not have those hours in it to give. She had not been wrong to want them, and he had not been wrong to keep the lights on, and one spring it had simply ended the way water finds its level, with no slammed doors, just a slow understanding on both sides. His mother had gone when he was 19, a stroke, fast, in the kitchen with the skillet still on the fire, so that the smell of scorched cornbread could still close his throat 16 years later. And his father had followed her 3 years after, as though the two of them could not run the shop and the marriage from opposite sides of the ground. So there was Terrell and the bay and the wrench and a corner of North St. Louis that brought him greens and called him by his first name and trusted him with the only thing that got them to work and to dialysis and to church. He was not unhappy. That was the thing people from outside the neighborhood could never quite believe. He had work that was good and that asked the truth of him every single day. Work he was flatly the best at for 3 zip codes in any direction. He had a chair waiting in the barber shop and a pan of greens in the little fridge and a name that opened doors on his own block. He was tired in his hands and his back, and sometimes in a place lower down than that, around February, when the days were short and the bills came in a clump. The holding company in Clayton had started putting language in its letters about the future of the corridor. A developer's sign had gone up on the empty lot beside the bay, white with blue letters, a new vision for the neighborhood. And everybody on the block walked past it and pretended not to read it, which is the way a neighborhood grieves a thing before it is gone. But he was not unhappy. He fixed what he could reach. The reach got a little shorter every year, and he fixed it anyway. That February, the reach was about to get a great deal longer than Terrell Brooks could have imagined, and he had no idea, because 40 years before any of it, on a back road outside the city, in a cold exactly like this one, a different man entirely had broken down and been afraid. Theodore Banks was 62 years old and worth, on the morning of that Tuesday, somewhere a little north of $1.3 billion, and he had spent 40 of those years failing to pay back $6. He had built Meridian Parts and Logistics out of a single rented loading dock on the south side in 1991, the same year, though he would never know it, that Otis Brooks was filing his initials into a wrench 4 miles north. By 2026, Meridian moved automotive parts to more than 1,100 shops across 9 states, ran 9 distribution centers and a fleet of 412 trucks, and had made Theodore Banks the particular kind of rich where the number stops meaning anything and becomes instead a sort of weather you simply live inside. He had a house in Ladue with rooms he had not walked into in a year. He had a board that wanted him to name a successor and step back, and a grandson at Howard who called every Sunday at 4. He had buried his wife, Deborah, 2 years and 3 months ago on a Thursday, and had not slept a full night through since. He, too, had come up out of Mississippi. Clarksdale, in the Delta, 60 miles up the highway from the town Otis Brooks left, close enough that the two men, had they ever once sat down across a table, would have known the same flat green going to the horizon, the same heat, with a weight to it, the same brick churches, and the same long iron road north out of the cotton. Theodore had left in 1985, 21 years old, with a high school diploma, a dead father's good name, and the iron conviction his mother had hammered into him over a washtub, that a man's whole worth was the sum of his squared accounts. "You don't owe, and you ain't owed," she used to say, snapping a wet sheet straight with a crack. "That right there is a free man. Everything else in this world is just somebody else's mule." He had believed her with the whole of his life. Every debt gets paid. A man who can't square his accounts is nobody's idea of a man. It was a good creed for a poor boy, and it made him, brick by brick, rich, and it nearly cost him the only thing that mattered. The night that wrote itself onto the rest of his life happened in February of 1986. He was 22, 3 weeks into St. Louis, down to his last folding money, and he had a 6:30 in the morning interview for a dock job at a freight company in Granite City. A real job, with a union behind it, the first door that had so much as cracked since he came north and started sleeping on a cousin's floor. The buses did not run to Granite City before dawn, so he had bought a 1974 Pontiac Le Mans off a man for $200 he did not have, and at 11:40 that night, on a county road with the temperature falling through the 20s, the Le Mans coughed twice and shuddered and died and would not turn over again, no matter how he begged it. He had no coat worth the name. He had no phone, because it was 1986 and he was poor, and the nearest lit window was a half-mile back. He had $4 and some loose change and an interview in 7 hours. That was the entire visible length of his future, and he sat in a dead car on a black road and felt the cold come up through the floor pan and into the soles of his feet and then his knees, and for the first time since they put his father in the ground, he was afraid in a way that had no bottom underneath it. A light came up behind him, a pickup, an old one, riding a little low on one side. It slowed as it passed and stopped, and the white reverse lights came on, and it backed up along the shoulder, and a man got out. A black man, maybe 30, in coveralls and a watch cap, with a long flashlight and a steel toolbox. A man who happened to be driving home from a fleet garage off Goodfellow at near midnight on a Tuesday, because that was when the work let a man work. He did not ask Theodore for anything. He came up to the window and looked at the kid's face for a second in the flashlight beam, and asked him gently to pop the hood. For 17 minutes the man stood in that cold with his head under the hood, while the kid worked the key on his say-so, and he listened to the engine try and fail to catch, and then he laid his bare hand flat on the block to feel it, and put his face down near the carburetor to smell the air coming off it, and said, half to himself in a voice straight up out of the Delta, "She ain't getting fuel," the way another man might say a fellow wasn't getting enough sleep. He pulled the fuel line and blew it clear, and traced the trouble to a filter packed solid with rust off the inside of a tank that had sat too long with too little gas in it, and he put in a spare he carried in the bed of his truck. Because he kept spares, because people broke down, because that was a thing he believed about the world. He turned a wrench in the dark that Theodore never got a clear look at, and the lemons caught and held and ran rough and then ran smooth. Theodore had $4. He held all of it out the window. The man looked at the bills the way a grown person looks at something a child is offering him, with a kind of patience that had no hurry in it and would not take them. Theodore got desperate then because his mother's voice was loud in his ears. You don't owe and you ain't owed. And he could not be a man who owed a stranger his whole future on a county road in the dark. And he pushed the money at the man, and his voice cracked clean in half on the second word. And the man reached in through the window and closed Theodore's cold fingers gently back over his own $4, with a hand that was somehow warm in all that cold, and said the thing that Theodore Banks would spend the next 40 years and a sizable fraction of a fortune failing to understand. Don't pay me back, the man said. Pass it on down the line. Then he took the stub of a pencil from his coveralls and a parts receipt from his shirt pocket, and he wrote something on the back of it in the cab light of his truck, and folded it once, and reached in and tucked it into Theodore's shirt pocket and patted it flat with 2 fingers. He climbed back into his truck and pulled off north toward the city, and his taillights went small, and then around a bend, and then gone, and Theodore Banks drove on to Granite City and sat in the freight company's gravel lot with the heater running on a quarter tank for 4 hours until the office opened at 6, and he got the job. The union job. The first dollar of the $1.3 billion, and he never saw the man again. He went back, though. That was the part that ate at him across 4 decades. As soon as he had a single week's pay in his pocket, he drove those county roads on his day off looking for an old low-riding pickup. He went to every fleet garage off Goodfellow and asked after a man 30 or so from down home who fixed a young fellow's car on the county road one freezing night. But it was 1986, and there were a dozen fleet shops along that boulevard and 100 men in coveralls who had come up the same train out of the same delta, and Theodore had no name to give, only a face half seen in a flashlight beam, a voice he would have known anywhere, and a folded receipt going soft in his wallet. The garage where the man worked changed hands twice in the long years it took Theodore to climb from the dock to the office to the loading dock business of his own, and by the time he was rich enough to hire people who find people, the trail was 30 years cold, and he had quietly convinced himself the man was most likely dead, and that this, somehow, was a debt he had been man enough to incur and not man enough to settle. So he did the only thing a man who believes that every debt gets paid can do when he cannot find his creditor. He tried to pay the whole world instead. He endowed a scholarship at the trade college, anonymous, for kids going into the automotive and diesel programs, 40 of them a year now, going on 20 years. He wrote checks to a dozen things with the word opportunity in their names. He gave the way a man bails a swamped boat, fast and steady and constant, and never once got ahead of the water, because you cannot bail your way out of a thing that is not a leak. None of it ever touched the place under his ribs where the county road stills, because he had taken a gift and turned it into an account, and an account cannot be closed by paying it to the wrong party, no matter how much you pay or how many parties you pay it to. Deborah had seen it long before he did. Theo, she told him, more than once in the years when she still had the breath to argue with him over the supper dishes, that man did not loan you a thing. He gave it to you, free and clear. The only way on God's earth to insult a gift is to try and pay it back. You pass it on. Like the man told you. And Theodore would nod and say she was right and go straight back to writing checks, because he did not know how to do the other thing, the thing with no number on it, no signature line, no way to file it and know it was finished. Deborah was gone 2 years now. He had a great deal he wished he had said yes to while she was still at the table. The receipt had gone soft and brown as a fallen leaf over 4 decades in the warm dark of his wallet. The pencil ghosted down almost to nothing. He had stopped being able to read what the man wrote on it sometime around his 50th birthday. He kept it anyway. He kept it the way Terrell carried the wrench, which is to say, without ever once calling it what it was. And there was the other thing, the thing Theodore Banks could not make himself look at straight. Meridian had been good for Theodore, and good for 1,100 shops, and good for 9 states' worth of jobs and pensions and kids put through school. And it had also, across 35 years of doing precisely the thing it was built to do, helped grind down into the dust the small 1- and 2-bay independent garages it had grown up beside. The corner shops could not buy parts at his volume. They could not get the proprietary diagnostic codes the car makers locked away and licensed out to the chains. They could not survive the way the whole business had bent itself, year over year, toward the big and the networked and the franchised. He had told himself for a long time that this was simply the weather of the market, and not the doing of any one man. He held an interest through a holding company over in Clayton he barely tracked anymore, in a couple of blocks up in North St. Louis, where the land had gone cheap and the future, his analysts assured him, was bright. He had initialed the memo without ever reading the names of the actual streets on the actual map. One of the streets was Ledoux. On the anniversary of that 1986 night, he never marked it out loud, and he would have denied keeping the date, but his hands knew it the way Terrell's hands knew the wrench. Theodore Banks did the one thing every year that let him breathe all the way to the bottom of his chest. He took the car out, not the German sedan with the driver up front. He kept in the third bay of a 6-car garage in Ledoux, a 1972 Buick Electra he had restored himself across 9 winters, the nearest thing in the world he could find to the long, proud father had owned for a single year in Mississippi before the bank came and took it back. He drove the Electra alone at night, slow on roads with no errand at the end of them, and he let himself remember the man on the county road, and he tried every February to mean those 5 words a little better than he had meant them the February before. That winter the Electra's idol had been hunting for a week, dropping low and uneasy at the lights, once nearly stalling out on Kings Highway in front of a city bus. He knew enough about an old motor to know it was likely the carburetor or a vacuum leak somewhere, an old car's old kind of trouble, the kind no scanner in the world can read because there is nothing on a 1972 Buick for a scanner to plug into and talk to. He should have left it home and called his man in the morning. He took it out anyway, because it was the one night of the year he always took it out. And at 11:47, with the temperature on the bank sign at the corner reading 38 degrees and dropping, on the corner of Ledoux and Carrowmore in North St. Louis, the Electra coughed twice and shuddered and died, and would not turn over. Theodore Banks sat in a dead car on a dark street, 62 years old and worth more than every house standing on the block around him put together, and felt the cold begin to come up through the floor pan into the soles of his good shoes, and for one long second he was 22 again, on a county road with $4 and no bottom under the fear, and he did not understand why his eyes had gone hot and full until he made himself stop and breathe and grip the wheel. Then he saw it. Halfway down the block, a single light still burning in a garage, 2 bays, a gold sign gone gray. The roll-up door was raised a few feet off the ground, and underneath it, lit from behind, a pair of work boots moving slow around a job. Terrell heard the knock come in over the radio. He had stayed late, which was nothing new for a Tuesday. He was finishing a brake job he had promised Miss Clara's nephew by the morning, and had no intention of billing the press work on. And the knock came soft and uncertain, 3 slow raps on the steel of the door, the knock of a man who is not at all sure he has the standing to be knocking. Terrell rolled out from under the truck on the creeper, wiped his hands down the red rag he kept tucked in his belt, and walked over and lifted the door the rest of the way up. There was an old man standing on the cold sidewalk in a very good coat, his breath smoking under the streetlight, next to a 1972 Buick Electra that anyone with 2 eyes could see had been loved all the way back to life one weekend at a time. Terrell knew the look of the man the way he knew the look of a particular kind of customer, a man who had never once in his whole life had to stand on a sidewalk and ask another man for help, and who did not have the words for it anywhere about him. The old man's face was working at something it could not quite get out. "I'm sorry to trouble you," Theodore said. "She died on me, right out here at the corner. I know it's late. A shop's hours are a shop's hours, and any business in the city, at 11:47 on a freezing Tuesday night, would have told the man to phone a tow truck and have a good evening." Terrell stood in the open mouth of the bay with the warm air going out past his shoulders into the cold and the radio playing low behind him, and he felt the pull of his own bed across town and his empty stomach and the brake job that still was not finished, and he looked at the old man's working face, and he did the arithmetic that was not arithmetic, the thing his father had done 1,000 times without ever knowing he was doing it. He stood there in the doorway for maybe 5 seconds. The exhaust from the dead Buick hung in the cold air over the street and did not move. Somewhere up Carrowmore a dog asked a single question into the dark and got no answer back. Then Terrell stepped aside and put his shoulder to the door and ran it all the way up to the top. "Push her in out the cold," he said. "Let's have us a listen." They got the Electra rolled into the second bay between them, leaning into the cold, heavy steel, the old man's good leather soles slipping a little on the frost on the apron until Terrell laid a flat hand on the trunk lid and took most of the weight himself, and the door came rattling down behind them, and the bay was warm and bright and close, and it smelled of motor oil and old coffee, and, underneath all of it, faintly, of the greens in the foil pan in the little fridge by the bench. Theodore Banks stood inside it and felt something in the back of his throat he could not name, because the bay smelled, almost exactly, like the inside of a memory. Terrell did not reach for a scanner. There was nothing on a 1972 Buick to plug a scanner into, and anyway the scanner was the last thing he ever went to and not the first. That was the part the young ones who came up on YouTube never learned, that the machine only tells you what already finished breaking, and your ears tell you what is breaking right now, while there is still time to catch it. He had the old man slide in behind the wheel and crank it on his count, and he stood at the open hood with his head cocked over to one side, listening to 455 cubic inches try to settle into an idle, and he laid the back of 2 fingers up near the base of the carburetor, and then his whole bare hand flat on the intake manifold, and he closed his eyes the way a man does when he is listening past the noise to the thing underneath it. "There," he said, mostly to himself. "She ain't holding vacuum. Hear how she hunts up and down like that, won't pick a number and stay on it? That's air getting in someplace it's got no business being." He moved his hand slowly along the manifold the way a doctor moves a hand down a back, feeling for the spot. "And your idle circuit's loading up rich on top of it. When she start dropping out on you at the lights?" "About a week ago," Theodore said. He had not moved an inch. He was watching the man's hands the way you watch a thing you used to know how to do. It took Terrell 11 minutes to find it, and he found it the old way, by hand and by ear, working a length of unlit vacuum hose around the back of the engine while the old man cranked and held the throttle where he was told. A line gone hard and brittle and split clean through at the back of the manifold, down where the heat lived and rotted rubber in a decade. A thing you could never see and could only hear and feel for. 80 cents of cracked hose on a billion-dollar man's beloved car. He had the right line on a spool on the wall. He cut a length, ran it, seated it, snugged the little clamp down with a nut driver. The carburetor wanted a touch too. The idle screw backed off maybe a quarter turn from somebody's 40 years of well-meaning adjustments, and for that he reached behind himself without looking, 2 fingers going to the back right pocket of his coveralls, and brought out the 5/8 and set it down on the fender within easy reach while he worked the screwdriver, the way a man sets down a thing he knows he is about to want. Theodore Banks looked at the wrench lying there on the fender the way you look at a face in a crowded room that you very nearly know. He did not say anything. He could not have told you why his eyes had gone to it. It sat there in the white shop light, worn soft and gray at the grip, an old forged 5/8 combination, while 4 miles and 40 years off in the back of his mind a different wrench turned in a different dark on a county road, and the bay was warm, and when Terrell told him to crank her one more time, the big motor caught and held and ran rough for 3 seconds, and then dropped down and ran smooth and even and true. "That'll hold you," Terrell said. He did not look up right away. He was listening to the idle settle in, the way you watch a fever finally start to come down. Vacuum line and a quarter turn on the idle screw, 8 cents of rubber. "I'll write you up a ticket if you want paper for it, but it ain't but a couple dollars of parts, and I was up under that truck anyhow." Theodore had his wallet out before Terrell had finished the sentence. The old reflex, the only language the man had ever been truly fluent in. "I'm not going to let you do that," he said. "It's near midnight and you got out from under a paying job to do it. Name me a number." Terrell wiped the screwdriver down and racked it on the bench. "I'd take the parts cost off you," he said. "Call it $3 even. I don't charge a man for 8 cents of line and listening to his motor a minute. My daddy'd come up out the ground." He said it plain, the way you state the weather. It was the cadence as much as the words themselves. Theodore Banks had heard 1,000 men say 10,000 things across 40 years of buying and selling, and his body had long ago learned the difference between a thing a man says and a thing a man means clean down to the floor, and this was the second kind, and it landed somewhere under his ribs that had been standing open and waiting 40 years to be landed on. He set the expensive wallet down slowly on the bench, and he sat himself on the stool beside it without being asked to. An old man all at once needing very much to sit down, and he looked for the first time around the bay. At the gold sign through the open office door, at the iron skillet sitting by the hot plate, at the foil pan in the cracked open fridge, and at a Polaroid taped to the wall above the bench, gone amber and curled at the corners with age, of a younger man in coveralls standing square in front of these same 2 bays, arms crossed, a wrench loose in one fist, grinning out at the camera like he owned the one good thing in the whole world and knew it. "Can I ask you something?" Theodore said, and his voice was not the voice of a man worth $1 billion and a third dollars. "Did your father fix cars for folks who couldn't pay him, even when it cost him to do it?" Terrell leaned a hip on the cool fender. He did not find the question strange, exactly. Tired men got to talking in his bay near midnight. It happened more than people would think. "I do what I can reach," he said. "Some weeks the reach is a good deal shorter than others. My father did it before me, and harder. Half this block is still running on free labor that man did back in the 80s and never said one word about, not even to my mother." He nodded up at the Polaroid. "That's him right there, Otis. He used to tell me the whole entire secret of the work was just 2 things. You tell folks the truth even the days I don't pay, And you don't ever keep a tab on a kindness. He said a tab is the fastest way in the world to turn a gift into a grudge. Theodore Banks went very still on the stool. And when somebody tried to force money on him for some little thing, Terrell went on, not noticing, winding the spare hose back onto its hook, he would not take it. Used to drive my mama half out her mind. He'd fold their money right back into their own hand and close their fingers over it, and he'd say, and here Terrell smiled, the particular small smile a man smiles at the dead. He'd say, "Don't pay me back, pass it on down the line." The bay went quiet enough to hear the new idol running smooth and patient behind them. Theodore did not move for a long moment. Then he reached up into his coat, into the inside breast pocket where a man keeps the few things he cannot make himself throw away, and he drew out a wallet that had cost more than every tool in Terrell's bay combined, and from a worn fold deep inside it he took a square of paper gone soft and brown as a leaf in November, a parts receipt 40 years old, and he held it closed in his palm, because he knew by heart that he could no longer read what was written on the back of it. "Son," he said, and stopped and had to start over. "What was your father's name, his whole name?" "Otis Brooks." Terrell straightened up off the fender now, slow, because something in the room had shifted under them, and his ears had caught the change in it the way they caught a bad lifter at 40 feet. "Why you asking?" Theodore Banks stood up off the stool. He crossed the 2 steps to the fender where the 5.8 lay in the light, and he picked it up. Terrell did not stop him, did not yet know there was any reason to, and he turned it over slowly in his soft old hands until the box end came up under the white shop light, and there, filed into the steel by a man who had wanted everybody in this world to know exactly whose it was, were 2 letters. "O.B." Theodore Banks read aloud the way a man reads a name carved into a stone. His thumb moved once slow across the worn bright steel of the letters, "Otis Brooks." He stood there holding the wrench the way you hold a thing you have spent your entire grown life searching for, and have just this second discovered was lying on a fender in the room the whole time you were looking. The half-second pulled itself long and thin. Terrell watched a complete stranger's face come apart into pieces in front of him, and could not for the life of him read the sentence that the pieces were trying to spell. "In the winter of 1986, Theodore said, and his voice had dropped down to almost nothing at all, "I broke down on a county road outside Granite City, 22 years old, $4 to my name and a job interview at 6 the next morning, that I had no way under heaven to get to. It was below freezing, and I had no coat to speak of, and I sat in a dead car on a black road, and I have never, before that night or one single day since, been that afraid of anything." He turned the wrench again, so the 2 letters caught the light a second time, as if to be certain of them, and a man came along in an old pickup near to midnight, coming home from a fleet garage off of Goodfellow Boulevard. He found my fuel line packed full of rust, and he put in a filter he carried in his own truck because he told me, "People will break down." He fixed my car with a wrench in the dark, and when I tried to hand him every dollar I owned in the world, he closed my hand back over it, and he said to me, "Don't pay me back," Terrell said. The words came up out of him before he had decided to say them. "Pass it on down the line." "Pass it on down the line," Theodore said. He held up the soft brown square of paper in his other hand, next to the wrench, and the 2 old things trembled together in the old man's grip. I could not read this anymore. I haven't been able to read it in years. But I know exactly what it says because I watched him write it in the cab light before he drove off and left me alive. He wrote, "You'll know when." And I have spent 40 years, and more money than this whole blust will see in a generation, trying to pay back $6 to a man I could not find. And I have been doing it dead wrong the entire time because he told me how to do it that night, in 5 words, and I did not listen to him. And your father, son, your father is the reason I am standing up in the world tonight to be standing in his son's garage. The wall came down then. Theodore Banks had not wept at his own father's graveside down in Mississippi when he was 16. He had not wept once across 35 years of building the company up out of a rented dock. He had wept exactly 1 time in 40 years at Deborah's funeral 2 years and 3 months back, and even then he had done it alone in the men's room with the water running full in the sink so that no living soul would hear him do it. Now, at 62 years old, in a 2-bay garage on the corner of Ladue and Carrowmore, holding a 5.8 combination wrench with another man's father's initials filed by hand into the steel, the thing he had been carrying since he was 22 finally grew too heavy to keep carrying upright. He sat back down hard on the stool and pressed the cold wrench flat to his forehead and wept the way a man weeps when the dam is 40 years thick. No sound to it at first, and then a sound, his big shoulders going. An old rich man crying in a warm bay while a dead mechanic's son stood over him, not knowing whether he was allowed to touch him. Terrell touched him. He laid one greased dark hand flat on the old man's shaking shoulder, The same way Pop Reuben had laid a hand on a 22-year-old's shoulder in the basement of Greater Mount Zion 12 years before, when Terrell himself could not stand all the way up under the weight of it. And he did not say one word because his father had taught him that too, without ever calling it a lesson. That there is a kind of trouble in a man you do not fix with words. You just stand in close to it, so the person does not have to be alone inside it. So that is what Terrell did. He stood close. The Electra idled smooth and patient behind the two of them. The skillet sat cold by the hot plate, and the young man in the amber Polaroid grinned out at the both of them from the wall, arms crossed, knowing the one thing that neither of them had known until tonight. When Theodore could finally talk again, he wanted of course to write a check. It was the only hand he had ever truly known how to play. He talked fast, the way the very rich talk when they have found a problem that they believe money is simply the right shape to fill. He would pay off the building outright. He would clear the medical paper. He would set Terrell up in a brand new shop in a part of town with money in it. He would put a number on it that would mean this man never again had to pull a brake job by himself at midnight in February, for a press fee he did not even charge. And Terrell Brooks, who was his father's son the whole way down to the floor, let the old man run all the way out of words, and then he said no. I appreciate it, he said, and he meant that, and he also dead meant the no. But you didn't hear what you just got through telling me one bit better than you heard it out on that county road in '86. He pulled the second stool over with his boot and then sat down on it, so that the two of them were eye to eye with the wrench lying on the bench between them. My daddy didn't fix your car so you'd owe him something. He would be embarrassed down to his shoes to know you spent 40 years walking around thinking you did, and you try and hand me a check now to make the thing square. You're doing the exact thing the man told you not to do, all over again. You'd be paying him back. Terrell shook his head slow. He don't want paying back. He never once wanted paying back, not from anybody, his whole life. He wants it passed on down the line. That right there is the only money that ever spent in this bay. Theodore Banks looked at him for a long, long time, and something in the old man's face that had been clenched shut like a fist for 4 solid decades finally came open. And what was left when it opened was not grief, and it was not guilt. It was, very nearly, the face of the 22-year-old kid in the dead lemons the instant the engine caught and held. The face of a man who has just been taken off of a hook he had forgotten there was any way to be taken off of. All right, Theodore said low. All right, then you teach me how a man passes it on down the line. Because I have got more line than just about anybody alive, son, and I have never once in 40 years known where the far end of it was supposed to go. What the two of them built over the next 4 months was not a check, though Theodore signed his name to plenty of paper along the way. It was a thing with labor down inside it, with sweat in it, which was the only kind of thing a Brooks would ever consent to stand inside of. The first thing Theodore Banks did, he did quietly, and Terrell only learned the shape of it weeks afterward. He went back to that holding company over in Clayton that he turned out to half own without ever having read its holdings, and he pulled the developer's interest off the blocks up in North St. Louis, Ladue, and Carrowmore, and the 2 streets that crossed them, and instead of clearing the corner he had the building that held Brooks Auto deeded over, free and clear, to a new nonprofit with a plain name and a real board, and he tore the rent up at the root. He did the whole of it inside of 1 week. It turned out, he said later, that when the man who signs the analyst's bonuses sits down and actually reads the real names of the real streets on the map, the bright future the analysts had drawn for him in the conference room comes to look like a very different thing. The bigger work took longer, because the bigger work was real, and real things take time and hands. They turned the 2 bays into 3. Theodore bought the empty lot the developer's white sign had stood on, and they cleared it and poured a slab and raised a 3rd bay over the winter. And behind it a clean little room with the proprietary diagnostic gear inside it that no independent one-man shop in the city could ever have dreamed of affording. The lockdown manufacturer codes, the subscription tools, the very moat that Theodore Banks's own industry had spent 30 years patiently digging around the necks of shops exactly like the one Otis Brooks had built and bled for. And then Theodore made some telephone calls he should have made 15 years earlier, and Meridian Parts and Logistics, to the open confusion of its board of directors, began quietly doing for independent 1- and 2-bay shops across all 9 of its states the thing it had only ever before done for the big franchise chains. Parts sold at a fair volume price, free training brought in, the codes unlocked. A small turn of a very large ship made slowly against the current the ship itself had spent decades making. It would not bring back the 1,000-corner garages the weather had already taken. Theodore knew that and said so. It was a start. His late friend Otis Brooks's son had taught him in one night was worth a great deal more than a finish a man could simply buy. But the true heart of the whole thing, the part that mattered, was the kids. Brooks Auto became, that spring and summer, a place where 6 teenagers from inside walking distance came after school let out and on Saturday mornings and got paid an honest hourly wage to learn the thing Terrell Brooks carried inside his head and his hands. A thing that could not be downloaded off any phone, could not be shipped overseas, could not be made obsolete by a software update, and would feed a person and that person's whole family for the rest of a life. He taught them the way his father Otis had taught him, and the way Otis's father had surely taught Otis on a Mississippi back porch before that. Hands first, the truth always, and the machine dead last. He taught them to lay a flat hand on a block and close their eyes and listen to an engine think before they ever plugged a single wire into it. He told them, the very first afternoon, the thing about never keeping a tab on a kindness, and he watched it land on 6 young faces and slide right off, the way it had once slid off his own, and he knew the way you know a thing you have lived, that it would come back around and land for good in about 12 years, at somebody's repast, with a plate of pound cake going cold in their lap. He mounted the wrench up on the wall. He had argued back and forth with himself a while over doing it, a tool that good and that true had a kind of duty to keep working, not to hang there gathering dust behind glass, but he came to understand in the end that this particular 5/8 had quietly become a different kind of tool than it had started out as. He set it on 2 small brackets up on the wall above the bench, right under the curling amber Polaroid, and beneath it he hung a small brass plate that Pop Rubin had walked with him down to a shop on Natural Bridge to have engraved. The plate did not say Otis Brooks. It did not say in loving memory. It said only the 5 words the man used to lay down on the table and let sit. The whole secret of the work, you fix what you can reach. And under that just 2 dates, the year he opened the bay and the year he closed his eyes. And not one thing more, because Otis Brooks would have been embarrassed by a fuss and his son knew it. The kids always asked about the 2 letters first. They always did. A boy of 15 with new locks and his grandfather's name and a real future sitting unopened in his hands would stand up close to the wall to read the worn steel. The way a person reads anything that has already been worn smooth by other people's hands long before it got to theirs, and he would ask, "Whose initials, Mr. Brooks?" And Terrell would stop what he was doing, and he would tell the boy about a man who had come up north out of Greenwood, Mississippi, on the Illinois Central in 1958. 18 years old, with a Bible and a cardboard suitcase and a wrench his own daddy had pressed into his hand on the train platform, and who had filed his own 2 initials into the one tool he swore he would sell the building before he ever sold, so that everybody coming after would know exactly whose it was, and ain't nobody could ever stand up and say different. Theodore Banks came back on Tuesdays. He did not run the place and never once tried to. He swept the floors, mostly, and handed the kids the wrong tool on purpose now and then, so that they would learn to stop and ask out loud for the right one by its right name. He told the story of the county road exactly one time, to all 6 of them at once over lunch on the bench with the foil pan of Miss Clara's cornbread going around, and then he never told it again, because some stories you say one time, clean, and then step back and let do their slow work in the dark. And on the anniversary that came around the following February, Theodore Banks did not take the Electra out alone on a road that led to nowhere. He drove it up to the bay, and Terrell came out and looked it over the way he looked over every car that mattered to a man, and the 2 of them sat together with the door run up a few feet and the heat going, and the river fog coming off the Mississippi a mile to the east. 2 men who had come up the same iron road out of the same delta, and had finally, after 40 years, found their way into the warm lit room. They did not deal. There was not anymore a great deal that needed saying. And somewhere 4 miles and 40 years off, a debt that had never truly been a debt at all finished doing the only thing a real gift has ever been able to do in this, which is to refuse to stop, and to keep on moving, quiet and unbilled, down the line. Here is the thing worth sitting with tonight, wherever it is you happen to be hearing this. For 40 years, Theodore Banks believed all the way down to the bone that he owed a man $6 and his entire life, and that one belief very nearly cost him every chance he ever had to feel like a free man inside his own skin. Otis Brooks, for his part, never once in his life believed Theodore owed him a single thing, so one of those 2 men was wrong about the debt. The only question worth asking is which one of them, and whether in the end it even matters. If a stranger does you a kindness you could never hope to repay, and then is gone before you can find him, do you owe him? The way Theodore was so dead sure he did, until the owing very nearly eats you alive from the inside? Or did the man close the whole account out himself, clean, the night he folded your own $4 back into your cold hand and pointed you on down the road toward the rest of your life? Maybe the only people who ever truly get free in this life are the ones who finally stop trying to pay the past back and start paying the next stranger in the cold forward instead. Or maybe that is just a comfortable thing we tell ourselves so we never have to settle up at all. I don't know. I'd like to hear what you think. If somebody once carried you when you had nothing in your pockets and no bottom under your fear, do you owe them? Or do you owe the next person you find standing out there in the cold? There's a line in tonight's story I keep coming back to. I'm not sure I believe it all the way. A man fixes a stranger's car in the cold. The stranger tries to pay him, and the man folds the money back into his hand and says, "Don't pay me back. Pass it on down the line." Here's the thing. I wrote that line, and I still don't know if it's true. Most of us never pass it on. We mean to. We say we will, and then the cold passes and we forget the face. I think about the people who got carried once. The guy whose car died at midnight and somebody just stopped. The kid somebody fed without making a thing of it. You don't always get to thank them. Sometimes they're already gone. So maybe the debt was never a debt. You can't go back. You can only go forward to the next person standing out in the cold. I don't know if I do this well. I'm trying to. That's the honest version. Terrell and Theodore aren't real. But the line is, "Don't pay me back. Pass it on down the line." This is a work of fiction. Brooks Auto, Meridian Parts and Logistics, Greater Mount Zion, Terrell and Otis Brooks, Theodore and Deborah Banks, and everyone and everything else in it are invented, and any resemblance to real people, companies, or events is coincidental.